1953, the aristocratic Englishwoman Dame Edith Sitwell sat down with Marilyn Monroe to have a conversation for Life magazine. This was commissioned because Life magazine thought that sparks would fly between the aristocratic Sitwell and Marilyn Monroe. However, it was not the case. Sitwell said of Marilyn, "On the occasion of our meeting, she wore a green dress and with her yellow hair looked like a daffodil." She described Monroe's face, saying, "In repose, her face was at moments strangely prophetically like a beautiful little ghost, a little fertility demon." And it's something that Sitwell admired about Monroe, and the two women actually had a lot in common. Edith Louisa Sitwell was born on September 7th, 1887 in Scarborough, North Riding of Yorkshire, England. She was a British poet and critic and the eldest of the three literary Sitwells. You can see her standing next to her father wearing a red dress in this 1900 portrait of the Sitwell family by John Singer Sargent. She was the only daughter of Sir George Sitwell of Renishaw Hall. He was an expert on genealogy and landscaping, particularly the Italian style of landscaping. Her mother was Lady Ida Emily Augusta née Denison, who was a daughter of William Denison, 1st Earl of Loughborough. She had two younger brothers, Osbert and Sacheverell, both of which would become distinguished authors like herself and long-term collaborators. In life, the sibling set was simply called the Sitwells. She described her own childhood as extremely unhappy and said her mother had terrible rages, while she rarely saw her father. Her mother married her father when she was just a teenager, and on her wedding night ran back to her own mother, saying she could not marry him. Her mother made Lady Ida return to Sir George Sitwell, who was widely thought of as an eccentric. He spent a lot of time in Italy and Switzerland, and so Edith Sitwell rarely saw her father. Her parents were also intent on physical beauty. Her father was a huge landscape artist and obsessed with his own health. He would mislabel his own medications so people would not take them. He was afraid people would take his medications, and he traveled with all of his medications to Switzerland and Italy regularly. Her father made Edith undertake a cure for her supposed spinal deformation, involving locking her into an iron frame, which she called My Bastille. She wrote in her autobiography that her parents had always been strangers to her. Her mother unfortunately struggled with alcoholism and would take long excursions to nobody knows where. Her mother pawned her own mother's own false teeth to buy drugs and would spend the family money incessantly, to the point that she landed herself in debtor's prison. And when she asked her husband to bail her out in 1915, he refused. And so she was imprisoned at Holloway Prison for 3 months. Her father, Sir George, was so eccentric that both children, Edith and Sacheverell, wrote a biography of him, and it's something where he struggled to pay the bills on his estate, especially Renishaw Hall, and so supposedly Sir George banned electricity in his household well into the 1940s. I don't know if he banned it or it was just too expensive to maintain, but either way, the guests had to use candles from 1940s onwards, and so did the family. He also lived on an exclusive diet of roasted chicken, and he had signs posted in front of his estate saying that nobody should disagree with him because it upset his digestion and made it difficult for him to sleep. He held his baronetcy for 81 years, longer than all three of his predecessors, and held a baronetcy for one of the longest period of time in England. He died in Switzerland, and he was a huge fan of little-known Baroque Italian art. And this eccentricity actually helped the family. The Italian art became very popular in the 1950s and 1960s, and so the family was able to live off of his eccentricity for a while. Edith Sitwell was over 6 feet tall, and she often dressed in an unusual manner with gowns of brocade, velvet, gold turbans, and many rings. One of her favorite stones was aquamarine. Her jewelry is now in the jewelry galleries of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. One of her brothers often said she dressed like an altar. She had these really remarkable headpieces, and her unusual appearance provoked critics at home as well as abroad. She was the subject of personal attacks from critics Geoffrey Grigson, F.R. Leavis, and Noel Coward. She was described as looking like modern poetry. People focused on her appearance instead of her body of work, which was remarkable. She published biographies of Queen Elizabeth of England as well as Victoria of England. She was really good at setting poetry to music, including Still Falls the Rain, which is about the London Blitz. And she was also a huge proponent of young poets. She helped get more of Wilfred Owen's poetry published, and you can view his video on my channel. She let her flat open to young poets such as Dylan Thomas, who basically recreated modern poetry as we know it. She was someone who struggled in her childhood. She did not attend her parents' funerals and actually lived with her governess, Helen Rutham, for a while in London. She just wasn't close to her parents, and some people could argue she struggled to fit in, but Sitwell became a huge proponent of eccentricity, and her book about English eccentrics was lauded by the British public. I consider Sitwell a very important figure in Western literature because without eccentricity, how would we have originality? How would we have complete uniqueness? And so I view Sitwell very, very positively, but unfortunately her parents and her critics did not. Sitwell was always looking for more money. She had a lot of expenses with Renishaw Hall, and so she took the commission to write for Life magazine and interview Marilyn Monroe in the 1950s. At this time, Monroe was married to Arthur Miller and wanted to be taken more seriously as an actress, and so she was in London, and the British film she was shooting in 1956, 1957 was The Prince and the Showgirl. And this film was produced and directed by Laurence Olivier, who was an established thespian, huge star of the British screen and the British theater. And so this film was shot in Technicolor at Pinewood Studios. Monroe had formed her own company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, through which she purchased the rights to Terence Rattigan's The Sleeping Prince. Olivier and his wife, Vivien Leigh, had played the lead roles in the original London production of the play. And so this play was incredibly important to Olivier. He loved his wife, Vivien, and the two at the time were establishing and building up the British theater scene with the National Theatre. Prior to that, Laurence Olivier had rebuilt up the old Vic, and so this production of The Sleeping Prince had emotional meaning to Laurence. The production of the play was difficult for Monroe. This was something she had never done before. She had never acted with an actor of the caliber as Laurence Olivier, and she was playing the role that his wife had played, and Vivien could be very emotional, so there was a lot of stress on set. On set, Monroe appeared dirty and disheveled. She never arrived on time, sometimes arriving as late as 3 days late. She never said a line the same way twice. She was unable to hit her marks on the set and needed to consult her acting coach, Paula Strasberg. Now, Strasbourg in images seems to have a very malicious presence. That's probably just my read on it, but Paula Strasberg was born Pearl Miller in 1909 in New York City, and she lived until 1966. She was actor and teacher Lee Strasberg, the founder of method acting. She was his second wife and the mother of actors John and Susan Strasberg. She had more than 20 stage roles in her life, and she was a member of the American Communist Party. And so she was Marilyn Monroe's acting coach and confidant until Monroe's death in 1962, and she supplanted the acting coach Natasha Lytess. Olivier did not think highly of Strasberg, I think rightfully. He did not let her into the studio, and it was something where the difficulties he had with Strasberg and Monroe caused him to age 15 years. When he evicted Strasberg from the set, it caused Monroe to refuse to continue shooting until Strasberg returned. So this was a very tense film set, and you can see it replicated in various Monroe biopics, including My Weekend with Marilyn. The Prince and the Showgirl was not a major box office success. I think audiences wanted to see Monroe as a sex pot, and maybe they were disappointed by this more serious acting role. Laurence Olivier also was an established theater actor, and so while he had great films in Hollywood, including Rebecca, and you can watch my Daphne du Maurier video on my channel about that, this was just not his preferred venue. And so I think that it's a great film. I think it's a good film, but unfortunately it failed to find success in the United States. At this time, Marilyn was reading a lot of literature, I think partly to keep up with her playwright husband, Arthur Miller. And so one of the topics that Edith and Marilyn got into was the philosopher Rudolf Steiner. I think this is sort of strange. Rudolf Steiner was an Austrian occultist, social reformer, architect, and he claimed he was a clairvoyant. He tried to find a synthesis between science and spirituality, and I think he was just a weirdo. From the age of 9 onwards, he claimed he could see dead people and that he carried the knowledge of the spiritual world within himself. He was also a critic, and so that might be why Sitwell was reading his work. She did pay attention to her critics, unfortunately, because so many of them were just so cruel. But I don't know why Monroe was reading Steiner, but it is a topic that they discussed in 1953. I think Sitwell was able to recognize a lot of herself in Monroe. Monroe underwent plastic surgery early in her career, which you can learn about on my channel about the Racket Club, and Edith was forced into a nose truss. There were prongs clamped onto her face, held in place by a leather belt buckled around her forehead. And this was done because her parents were so intense about beauty and health in her father's case, and her mother was just mentally ill. Her 2 brothers were both highly dysfunctional and self-absorbed, and I think Marilyn might have resonated with that because many of her Hollywood friends were self-absorbed and difficult to get along with, and Marilyn's own mother struggled with mental health. Edith also was unlucky in love. In 1927, she fell in love with a homosexual Russian painter, Pavel Chalechu. They developed a close friendship, with Sitwell regularly helping him financially and publicizing his work. However, she was often hurt by his unpredictable temper and seeming lack of appreciation for her efforts on his behalf, and it suggested that he toyed with her expectations of romance. And this is sort of similar to the relationship she had with Sigrid Sassoon in 1918. Sassoon was also gay, but he cared deeply for Sitwell, but he could not give her what she wanted romantically, and so this hurt her. I think this is similar to Marilyn's marriages. Unfortunately, Marilyn was seeking something in her marriages that I don't know if she was ever able to find. I'm referring specifically to her marriage with Joe DiMaggio, where it seemed like she wanted a more intellectual partner, which she found in Arthur Miller, but that also did not work out. And so I think with the two women, we see this seeking.